Jasmine had just finished a long day at work. She was 8 months pregnant, and she was eager to get home to her family. It had been a challenging day, and she was looking forward to relaxing, maybe watching a movie with her 2 young children, and getting some much-needed rest. The warm, late afternoon sun made the drive pleasant, and as she turned onto a quieter street, she felt a sense of peace. Her car hummed softly as it moved along the road. She adjusted the seat to make herself more comfortable, as her pregnancy was making long drives harder. Her mind wandered to the tasks waiting at home, but her thoughts were interrupted when she saw flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She frowned, uncertain about why she was being pulled over. There hadn't been any signs of traffic violations. Maybe she had missed a stop sign, or perhaps it was a routine check. She signaled and pulled her car to the side of the road. Jasmine sat in her car for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't used to being stopped by the police, and the sight of the patrol car behind her made her anxious. She had always been taught to be respectful when interacting with the police, so she rolled down her window, preparing for whatever the officer might ask. A police officer, Officer Hayes, approached her car. He was tall, with a serious expression on his face, and he didn't greet her with the usual friendly tone she had come to expect from police officers in her neighborhood. Instead, he looked at her sternly, then at her car, then back at her, before speaking in a commanding voice. "Ma'am, step out of the car," Officer Hayes said abruptly. Jasmine felt a knot form in her stomach. She was confused. She hadn't done anything wrong. Was this part of a routine check? Was it something to do with her driving? She hesitated, then tried to ask, "Is there a reason you're pulling me over, officer?" Without warning, the officer raised his voice. "Step out of the car. Now." I said, "Step out." Jasmine's heart began to race. She was pregnant, and the idea of stepping out of the car quickly didn't seem safe for her or her baby. She knew it was important to stay calm, but her mind was filled with questions. Why was he asking her to get out? Was there something wrong with her vehicle? She glanced nervously around, hoping there was some explanation. But Officer Hayes' tone made it clear he wasn't asking politely. "Officer, please, I'm pregnant. Can you tell me why you're asking me to get out?" Jasmine said, her voice trembling slightly. She was trying to keep her calm, trying to explain that her condition might make this a little more difficult for her. But the officer's expression grew more impatient. "I don't have time for your excuses. Get out of the car now." Jasmine's anxiety was growing. She knew that with her pregnancy, she had to be careful. The officer's tone and behavior were making her feel increasingly uncomfortable. She looked around to see if anyone was nearby who might notice the situation. There were a few cars passing by, but it was mostly quiet on this street. Still, she could feel her hands shaking as she slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, trying to comply with the officer's demand. As she opened the door to step out, she felt a sharp tug on her arm. The officer grabbed her roughly, pulling her away from the car. "I told you to get out. Now stay still." Jasmine stumbled as she was yanked, the suddenness of it making her dizzy. "Please, I don't understand why you're doing this. I've done nothing wrong." Her voice was filled with fear, but also with confusion. Why was the officer acting this way? Jasmine was now standing outside the car, but the officer didn't loosen his grip. She felt vulnerable and scared. The last thing she wanted was to harm her baby, and she was terrified that the officer's rough treatment could cause something to go wrong. "You don't have any right to do this," she said, trying to pull away. But Officer Hayes didn't listen. He kept his grip firm, and now he was shouting at her, his voice echoing in the empty street. Jasmine, terrified and helpless, had no idea what to do. Her mind raced, wondering if she should call someone for help, or if she should just try to stay calm and hope this was some kind of mistake. Unbeknownst to the officer, a young man named Marcus had been walking along the street when he noticed what was happening. Marcus, a local resident, had been on his way home when he saw the officer pull Jasmine over. At first, he didn't think much of it, but as the situation escalated, He realized the officer was being aggressive toward a pregnant woman. Marcus quickly grabbed his phone and started recording. He knew that having a video would be important, especially if things got out of hand. As he filmed, he could see the fear in Jasmine's eyes, and it made him more determined to make sure the officer's actions were documented. The situation felt surreal, and she couldn't understand why the officer was treating her this way. Her mind raced with thoughts of her unborn child. She could feel her heartbeat in her chest as fear and confusion took over her. "Please," she pleaded again, her voice shaking. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home. I'm pregnant, and I don't feel safe like this." The officer didn't respond to her. Instead, he continued to hold her arm with a firm grip, ignoring her pleas for understanding. Jasmine was starting to feel lightheaded, her body overwhelmed with the stress and tension of the situation. She needed to get away from the officer, but she couldn't move because of his hold on her. Just as Jasmine started to feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her, she heard a voice behind her. It was Marcus, who had been standing a few yards away, recording the entire exchange on his phone. "Hey," Marcus called out, his voice loud and clear. "What's going on here? Why are you treating her like that?" Officer Hayes turned briefly to face Marcus, but didn't release his grip on Jasmine. "Mind your business," the officer snapped, his tone harsh. "This is between me and her." Marcus wasn't backing down. He knew what he was seeing wasn't right, and he wasn't going to stay silent. "She's pregnant. Why are you pulling her out of the car like that? She hasn't done anything wrong." Jasmine turned her head slightly, grateful that someone was standing up for her. She could hear Marcus's voice growing more intense, demanding that the officer let her go. The officer seemed to hesitate for just a moment, as if unsure of how to respond to someone questioning his authority in front of an audience. But instead of backing off, he took a step closer to Jasmine, his face still stern and unfazed. "You need to get out of here," Officer Hayes growled at Marcus, still not releasing his hold on Jasmine. "This doesn't concern you." But Marcus wasn't leaving. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm just making sure you don't hurt her. This is wrong, and you know it." As Marcus continued to film, the tension between the officer and the bystander grew. Jasmine's heart was pounding in her chest, but she was starting to feel a sense of relief knowing someone was witnessing what was happening. Maybe this would be enough to stop the officer from treating her so roughly. The situation was escalating quickly, but Jasmine kept her focus on staying as still as possible, trying not to make any sudden moves that could further agitate the officer. Her mind raced, worried about the impact all this stress could have on her baby. She tried to keep her breathing steady, even though every part of her wanted to break down in frustration. "Sir, please," Jasmine said again, her voice quieter now, but filled with desperation. "I'm just trying to get home. I'm not a criminal. I just want to go home." The officer finally seemed to acknowledge the crowd that had gathered at a distance, though he still didn't let go of her arm. He glanced toward the small group of onlookers, their phones raised, capturing every moment of what was happening. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their disbelief at the situation making it clear that this wasn't the way things were supposed to be handled. Jasmine was feeling exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She just wanted the ordeal to end. The officer's harsh treatment had already made her feel small and helpless. She didn't know how much more of this she could handle, but she couldn't give up. She had to stay strong, not just for herself, but for the baby she was carrying. Just then, another squad car arrived, and a second officer stepped out. He approached Officer Hayes, his expression serious but not aggressive. The second officer noticed the crowd gathering and immediately understood the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm but calm. Officer Hayes tried to explain himself, saying that Jasmine had been uncooperative, but the second officer, after quickly assessing the scene and noticing Jasmine's state, spoke up. "Let her go," he said firmly. "She's pregnant. What's going on here isn't necessary." For the first time since the incident started, Jasmine felt the grip on her arm loosen, Officer Hayes reluctantly released her, but his expression remained cold. The second officer stepped forward and gestured for Jasmine to sit on the curb, making sure she was okay. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the second officer asked, his voice softer than the first officer's had been. Jasmine nodded, still feeling overwhelmed but grateful that someone was finally showing her some empathy. Marcus, who had been standing to the side, approached Jasmine to make sure she was okay. He was still recording, but he now focused the camera on Jasmine's face, making sure she was not hurt and had the support she needed. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. As the second officer spoke to Jasmine, she slowly tried to calm her racing heart. The first officer, Officer Hayes, remained quiet, his expression still firm, though the second officer's arrival seemed to have brought some relief. Jasmine's legs shook as she sat down on the curb, trying to steady herself. The thought of what could have happened if no one had been there to witness the officer's actions made her stomach churn. "Thank you," Jasmine said softly, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke to the second officer. He gave her a kind, reassuring smile, a stark contrast to the anger she had seen in Officer Hayes. "You're welcome," the second officer replied, crouching beside her. "I'm sorry for what happened." Jasmine nodded, feeling both relieved and still uneasy. "Yes, I'm pregnant. I don't understand why he did that. I didn't do anything wrong." The officer nodded sympathetically. "I understand. I don't know why Officer Hayes handled it that way. We'll take care of this situation. Just try to stay calm." Jasmine took a deep breath, her mind still trying to process the sudden outburst of aggression. She had never imagined that a simple traffic stop would turn into something so terrifying. Her baby moved gently within her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to focus on that reassuring feeling. Despite everything, the baby was safe, at least for now. Meanwhile, Marcus stood nearby, his phone still recording, though he had lowered it to give Jasmine some space. He had witnessed the entire incident, and it had left him with a mix of anger and disbelief. He couldn't understand how someone, especially an officer of the law, could treat another human being like that. He had always been taught to stand up for what's right, and today, that's exactly what he did. His video had captured everything, and he knew it might be important later. The second officer stood up and walked over to Officer Hayes, who hadn't said much since the second officer arrived. They exchanged a few quiet words, the second officer's tone firm yet calm. Jasmine could only hear bits of their conversation, but she knew it wasn't good news for Officer Hayes. Officer Hayes looked at Jasmine one last time before getting into his patrol car, his face still full of frustration. The second officer, however, stayed with her, making sure she felt safe. "I'm going to have a word with him," the second officer said. "You're not going to be treated like this again. We take things like this seriously." Jasmine nodded gratefully. She was still shaken, but she appreciated the officer's kindness. She had no idea how the situation would unfold, but she knew that the support she was receiving from both the second officer and Marcus was helping her regain her strength. As the second officer continued to speak with Officer Hayes, a few more cars passed by, some of the drivers pausing to stare curiously at the scene. Jasmine could hear murmurs from a few bystanders who had gathered further down the street, talking amongst themselves. Some of them were visibly upset, shaking their heads, while others seemed to be checking their phones to get a glimpse of what had happened. It was clear that this wasn't just another routine traffic stop. It had sparked something in the community. After a few minutes, the second officer returned to Jasmine, his expression much softer. "I've talked to Officer Hayes, and we got everything under control. He's going to be investigated for his actions, and you won't have to deal with that kind of treatment again," he said. "I'm really sorry you had to go through that." Jasmine felt a wave of relief wash over her as she listened to the officer's words. She hadn't expected this outcome. She had feared that her voice wouldn't matter, that no one would listen to her side of the story. But the second officer had not only listened, he had taken action. "Thank you," Jasmine whispered. "I just want to go home. "I understand," the officer said kindly. "I'll make sure you're safe on your way. Just take your time. Don't rush." Jasmine stood up, still feeling a little unsteady but grateful for the support she had received. Marcus, who had been standing nearby, approached her once again. "You good?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Jasmine smiled faintly, feeling grateful for the kindness he had shown. "I'm okay, thanks to you." Marcus nodded and gave her a small smile. "Don't worry about it. I'm glad I could help." As Jasmine got back into her car, the second officer made sure the scene cleared and the road was safe for her to drive. He waved her on, and with a grateful nod, she slowly pulled away from the scene. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but she felt stronger now. The ordeal wasn't over, but she knew she had done the right thing by standing up for herself, and the support she had received from Marcus and the second officer had made a world of difference. The next day, Jasmine woke up early, feeling tired but relieved. The events of the previous afternoon were still on her mind, and as much as she tried to focus on other things, she couldn't shake the image of Officer Hayes dragging her out of her car. Her hands, though still a little shaky, had found strength in the support she had received from Marcus and the second officer. It wasn't over yet, but Jasmine felt a small sense of hope. As she prepared for her day, Jasmine couldn't help but think about her baby. She had been through so much in such a short amount of time, and the stress of the situation was something she could never have anticipated. Despite everything, she knew that she needed to stay calm and keep her focus on what mattered most, her health and the well-being of her child. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a text from Marcus. "Hey, Jasmine. I just wanted to check in and see if you're okay. I know things were rough yesterday, but I'm really glad you're safe." Jasmine smiled as she read his message. She quickly typed back, "Thanks, Marcus. I'm doing better now. It's just been a lot to process, you know." She stared at the screen for a moment, thinking about how unexpected his kindness had been. Marcus had been a stranger, someone she had never met before, yet he had stepped up when she needed help the most. He had seen what was happening and made sure someone was watching, making sure the truth would come out. The next part of the day was filled with normal tasks, work, errands, and keeping up with her kids. But Jasmine's mind kept drifting back to the situation with the officer. She knew that the encounter was far from over, and there were still questions left unanswered. Would there be consequences for Officer Hayes? Would he be held accountable for what he had done? Jasmine had no idea, but one thing was clear: she couldn't let it go. Later that afternoon, Jasmine received a call from the second officer, Officer Green, who had been more understanding during the incident. He apologized again for what had happened and assured her that the department was taking the matter seriously. "We've opened an investigation into Officer Hayes' actions, and I want you to know that you won't have to go through anything like this again," Officer Green said on the phone. "Your safety is our priority, and you have the right to be treated with respect." Jasmine felt a sense of relief wash over her as she listened to Officer Green's words. He was kind and considerate, and she appreciated the reassurance. He told her that she would be kept updated as the investigation continued, and that she could always reach out if she had any concerns. His words brought comfort, but Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. Even with this progress, the system wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always quick to address these issues. She ended the call and sat for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. There were still so many unknowns, but for the first time, Jasmine felt a small glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this. Marcus had helped her when she couldn't, and Officer Green had listened when she needed someone to hear her. The support from others made all the difference, and she knew that standing up for herself was the right choice, even when it seemed difficult. A few days later, news about the incident began to spread. The video Marcus had taken had gone viral, and Jasmine's story was now being shared by people all over the country. It wasn't long before people started to speak out about what had happened. Many were outraged by Officer Hayes' actions, and the police department found itself under increasing pressure to address the situation. Jasmine felt a mix of emotions as she saw the story unfold, but one thing stood out above all: the power of having people stand by her. That evening, Jasmine sat down with her children for dinner. As they ate, she thought about what the future held. She was determined to stay focused on her goals and to continue to be the strong, loving mother she had always been. The incident with Officer Hayes had shaken her, but it had also inspired her to keep going. She had made a difference, even if it was just by sharing her story. And now she knew that her voice mattered. As she looked at her children, their smiles filling the room with warmth, Jasmine realized that the greatest strength came from within. She had faced a difficult situation, but with the support of others and her own resilience, she had gotten through it. And with every day that passed, she grew more determined to live her life with courage, to teach her children the importance of standing up for what is right, and to always be an example of kindness and strength. The days ahead were uncertain, but Jasmine knew that she was no longer alone. She was part of a community that had her back, and that gave her the strength to face whatever came next. The news coverage of the event had brought the community together in ways that surprised her. People from all walks of life had reached out to her, offering encouragement, and many shared their own stories of similar experiences. Jasmine's phone was buzzing constantly with messages and calls. Some were from family and friends, checking in on her well-being, while others were from people she didn't know, strangers who had heard about her story through social media or news reports. It was overwhelming at times, but in a good way. People were showing her the kind of support that made her feel less alone, and that had given her a sense of empowerment. One afternoon, while Jasmine was at home, a news reporter called her. They wanted to interview her and share her side of the story with a wider audience. At first, Jasmine wasn't sure. She had never been in the spotlight before and didn't know if she was ready to speak publicly about the events. But after speaking with her family and thinking about how much this could help raise awareness, she agreed. The interview was scheduled for the following day, and Jasmine spent the night preparing. She thought about the questions she might be asked, the words she would say, and how she could share her story in a way that would make a difference. Jasmine wasn't interested in revenge. What mattered most to her was spreading awareness, showing people the reality of how some individuals were treated, and how this kind of injustice had to stop. The next morning, Jasmine stood in front of the camera. The reporter, a kind woman named Anna, made her feel comfortable, assuring her that she didn't need to worry about being perfect. The conversation began, and slowly, Jasmine opened up. She spoke about the incident with Officer Hayes, the fear she had felt, the confusion of not understanding why she was being treated like that, and the helplessness she experienced in that moment. She explained how it affected her physically and emotionally, but she also shared how, despite the fear, she had felt a growing sense of support from those around her. Being pregnant, Jasmine said during the interview, "You're already facing challenges that others may not understand. And when something like this happens, it only adds to the fear. But I'm not alone in this. People are supporting me, and that makes me strong." As she spoke, Jasmine could feel a sense of clarity. She wasn't just talking about herself anymore. She was speaking for others who had experienced similar mistreatment, but never had a chance to share their story. She realized that by telling her truth, she could inspire others to do the same, to raise their voices and demand fairness. The reporter nodded, clearly moved by Jasmine's words. "Your strength is inspiring, Jasmine," Anna said gently. "What do you hope comes out of this experience?" Jasmine paused for a moment, thinking deeply. "I hope this serves as a reminder that we all deserve to be treated with respect, no matter our race, gender, or circumstance. We need to see change in how people are treated by those in positions of authority. This shouldn't happen to anyone, and I want to make sure that it doesn't." As the interview wrapped up, Jasmine felt a sense of peace. It wasn't easy to relive what had happened, but sharing her story had been freeing. She knew that she was helping to create a conversation that needed to happen, one that would hopefully lead to meaningful change. Over the next few days, the story continued to spread. More news outlets picked it up, and more people rallied around Jasmine, showing their support in the comments and sharing the video of her interview. Many people expressed their admiration for her courage in speaking out. Some even shared their own experiences of encountering similar injustice, sparking a broader dialogue about police reform and the treatment of people of color in their communities. Jasmine didn't expect fame, and she wasn't seeking attention, but she was grateful that her story was sparking important conversations. As the weeks went by, the investigation into Officer Hayes continued. While Jasmine didn't know exactly how it would turn out, she had faith that change was coming. The people who had rallied behind her were proof of that. It was a reminder that when a community comes together, real progress can be made. Jasmine still had a long way to go before she fully recovered from the trauma of what had happened. But she no longer felt like a victim. She felt like someone who had the power to change things, someone who had found her voice and was ready to speak for those who couldn't. As she sat at home that evening, with her children playing around her, Jasmine felt proud. She had done what was right, and that gave her strength to face whatever was next. The journey hadn't been easy, but Jasmine knew that with the support of others, she was stronger than ever. One evening, Jasmine sat down with her family for dinner. Her children were chatting excitedly about their day at school, while Jasmine's husband, Malik, was busy making sure everyone had enough to eat. But Jasmine could sense that something had shifted in the atmosphere. The love and support from her family always grounded her, but she couldn't ignore the weight of the conversation that was unfolding outside their home. "I saw your interview on TV today," Malik said, looking up from his plate. His voice was filled with pride, but also concern. "You did amazing, but are you okay with all this attention?" Jasmine paused for a moment, her fork hovering over her plate. She looked at Malik and smiled softly. "I'm okay. I mean, it's a lot to take in, but I know that sharing my story is important. It's bigger than just me, Malik." Malik nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I know, and I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself and others. But just be careful. This isn't going to be easy." Jasmine felt her heart swell with gratitude. Malik had always been her rock, and his support meant everything to her. They had been through so much together, and this was no different. She nodded, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm ready for whatever comes next. I just want to make sure no one else goes through what I did. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt unsafe, who's ever been treated unfairly." As dinner went on, the conversation shifted back to lighter topics, talking about the kids' school projects, upcoming family plans, and even a joke about how Malik had burned the toast that morning. Jasmine found comfort in these small moments. It reminded her that while the world outside her home might be filled with uncertainty, within the walls of her house, she was safe, loved, and supported. The next day, Jasmine received a call from Officer Green, the second officer who had helped her during the incident. He informed her that the investigation into Officer Hayes was still ongoing. He reassured her that the department was taking the matter seriously and that there would be consequences for his actions. Jasmine listened carefully, feeling both relief and a sense of justice. She had been worried that the investigation might get swept under the rug, but Officer Green's words gave her hope. "We've reviewed all the footage from the incident," Officer Green explained, "and we've received several statements from witnesses, including the young man who recorded the event. Officer Hayes' actions were unprofessional, and we're holding him accountable." Jasmine felt a sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't just the fact that Officer Hayes was being held accountable. It was the realization that her voice had made a difference. She wasn't just a passive bystander in this situation anymore. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, had made sure that the system would hear her. Over the following weeks, Jasmine continued to speak out, attending community meetings, and participating in conversations about police reform. She shared her story with anyone who would listen, advocating for fair treatment for everyone, regardless of their race or background. Her strength and resilience became a symbol of hope for many in her community. One afternoon, As Jasmine was sitting in her living room, scrolling through her phone, she saw a message from Marcus, the man who had recorded the video of the incident. He sent a simple text: "Just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. You're inspiring so many people, Jasmine." Jasmine smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. She typed back, "Thank you for everything, Marcus. You played a big part in making sure the truth was heard. I couldn't have done this without you." Her phone buzzed a few seconds later. "We're all in this together, Jasmine. Don't forget that." The words meant more to her than she could express. It wasn't just her standing alone. It was the support of her community, the people who had witnessed what happened, and the ones who had fought with her to make sure her voice was heard. As the investigation continued, Officer Hayes faced disciplinary action. His actions were scrutinized, and the department took steps to ensure that similar incidents wouldn't happen in the future. Jasmine knew that this was just one step in a long process, but it was an important one. It was a step toward justice, a step toward making sure that those in power treated everyone with respect, no matter their race, gender, or background. Jasmine was far from being finished with her fight for justice, but she knew one thing for sure: she had made an impact. She had used her voice to make a difference, and as long as she could, she would continue to stand up for what was right. With her family, her community, and the support of people like Marcus, Jasmine knew she had the strength to keep moving forward, one step at a time. A few weeks after the community meeting, Jasmine's life began to return to a sense of normalcy. She still felt the weight of what had happened, but she was no longer consumed by it. The support she had received from her neighbors, friends, and family had made all the difference. The encouragement from those around her reminded her that even though one voice could spark change, it was the collective strength of a community that truly made an impact. Jasmine had seen more positive results than she expected. The community meeting had led to a series of actions. Local leaders and activists had come together to work on creating a task force aimed at improving relations between law enforcement and the community. They were planning workshops to educate people about their rights and offering training to police officers on how to handle situations with greater sensitivity and respect. Jasmine felt proud knowing that the small steps she had taken, sharing her story, standing up for what was right, had started a ripple effect. It wasn't about one person or one incident. It was about creating change for everyone who had faced unfair treatment and for those who would face it in the future. One evening, Jasmine received another call from Officer Green. "I just wanted to update you on the progress of the investigation," he said. "Officer Hayes has been dismissed from the department, and there are now new procedures in place for handling similar incidents. We're making real changes." Jasmine felt a deep sense of relief. Though the road ahead would still have its challenges, hearing that Officer Hayes was being held accountable gave her hope. It showed her that the system could be made better, one step at a time. After the call, Jasmine sat with her family, reflecting on everything that had happened. Her children were playing in the background, and as she watched them, she realized that this fight was for them, too. It wasn't just about her. It was about making sure they grew up in a world where fairness and justice were always the priority. The following weeks brought more positive news. Jasmine was invited to speak at a local high school about her experience and the importance of standing up for yourself and others. She was nervous at first, but when she stood in front of the students, she realized how much of a difference her story could make. She spoke about the power of kindness, the strength in unity, and the importance of using your voice for good. The students listened intently, and Jasmine could see the spark of inspiration in their eyes. She didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: Jasmine had found her purpose. The journey had been difficult, and there were still challenges to face, but she was ready for whatever came next. With the support of her community and the lessons she had learned, Jasmine knew that change was possible. And as she looked at her children, she smiled, knowing she was creating a better world for them, one step at a time.